Hello, I am Dr. Andrew Walsh, Culver Stockton College, and this is the Religion in America course. Today, this is my final lecture, and we will be talking about world religions in America. And we've talked a little bit about some of these traditions. We have spent a significant amount of time talking about Christianity. We've talked some about Judaism. We really have not talked about the other traditions so much, so we will do that today. First of all, I would like to point out how religion in America is somewhat different than religion globally. And we're going to start by looking at this chart. Okay, so globally, we see that Christians represent just under 1/3 of the world's population. Muslims are about 1/4 of the population, unaffiliated 16. Hindu is the next largest grouping, followed by Buddhist. And Pew Research Center, these are the sources I'm using, are sources that provide a lot of statistical information, polling data. They are one of the best resources for exploring the academic study of religion. They are highly regarded. Um, so if we compare the United States and the rest of the world, we see that in the United States, roughly half of the US population would identify as some form of Protestant. We see 25% evangelical Protestant, 15% mainline Protestant, 6% historically Black. Catholics represent about 21%. You'll see slight variations depending on their methodology. Mormons, 2%, other Christians, Jews, 2%, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, 1%. So this is a way of looking at religion in the United States, 23% unaffiliated. Some of those unaffiliated, if forced to choose, may actually choose one of the religions above. So this does not necessarily tell us how strongly they affiliate with religion, just that when asked if they identify as being a part of a particular tradition, this is what they would say. So we have talked sufficiently about Christianity in this course. We've talked quite a bit about Judaism. We talked about Abraham and the original covenant between God and Abraham, God promising land, and that one day Abraham's descendants would be more numerous than the stars. In exchange, Abraham promised to circumcise his male descendants. They talked about the land that his ancestors would someday acquire, and that notion of the promised land was used by later Europeans to justify colonization of non-Christian lands as well. So these stories of the Exodus, covenant, Abraham, the Torah, we've talked about these before. But part of what I want to focus on right now is that Christians using the Old Testament and Jews reading the Torah are going to draw some different conclusions, in part because Christians adapted some of the Jewish traditions and they look at things differently than, let's say, Jews would. For example, many Christians place a great deal of emphasis on the notion of original sin. In fact, St. Augustine argued if Adam and Eve had never known suffering, change, and had never known sin, we would never have death, we would never have suffering, toil, sorrow. So the origin of those things comes because of original sin. Now, the Jewish tradition does not have this same doctrine of original sin, doesn't assume that there was this wonderful relationship with God that was then cosmically destroyed. That's a particularly Christian interpretation. Christians, in using the the Hebrew Bible as Old Testament, also changed the order of events, placing the prophets last, even though they were written before some of the wisdom literature. But Christians did that because they thought the prophets pointed to Jesus as the Messiah. Obviously, one of the biggest differences between Judaism and Christianity is that Jews do not recognize Jesus as the Messiah. Um, First of all, the term Messiah means anointed one. And even in Jesus' lifetime, what most Jews expected was a warrior hero who would save them from the Romans. Jesus certainly did not save the Jewish people from the Romans. Instead, there were two major revolts that the Jews rose up against the Romans. In the first major revolt, the Jewish temple was destroyed in the year 70. And the second revolt, all practicing Jews were basically kicked out of the promised land after the year 135. Um, Christians interpreted the Messiah as being the same as one with God, as being um, the Son of God, and these notions would have not made a whole lot of sense to traditional Jews and probably contemporary Jews. One of the biggest differences between Christianity and Judaism is the Christian doctrine of the Trinity. God is three and one, that Jesus is one with God. So after Jews were kicked out of Israel, out of Judea, they often found themselves in small shtetls in predominantly Christian and later Islamic societies. And in order to maintain their identity, they often lived in shtetls, small Jewish ghettos, in order to maintain their distinctive dietary laws, distinctive clothing, distinctive beliefs and practices. The anti-Semitism that was experienced during the Holocaust came to a crescendo in the 1930s and 40s, but it had been brewing for some time. Some Christian theologians had identified Jews as rejecting Christ or Christ killers. There has been times where Jews and Christians were able to work together. If we go back to the golden age of, let's say, Maimonides, working side by side in some ways with Muslim and Christian scholars. And there have been other times where there has been a great deal of hostility. Well, as a result of the Holocaust and the persecution that Jews have experienced throughout much of their history, we recognize that Jews in the United States have often identified themselves as standing with the underdogs, standing in solidarity with the oppressed, the other victims of bigotry and violence and hatred, believing that in order to protect themselves, they have to be concerned about the well-being of other people, other minorities, and that the only way to promote human rights for themselves is to promote human rights for all. So there's been a long history of liberalism associated with Judaism. We talked in this class about how Reform Judaism, under the leadership of Isaac Meyer Wise, led the Jewish tradition in the United States into a largely liberal, modernist, accommodationist perspective, let's say compared to more Orthodox or Hasidic Judaism, which has a more traditional Jewish sectarianism, trying to maintain their identity. A tradition that we have not sufficiently talked about at all in this course, though, is Islam. So it is the second largest religion in the world, and one of the larger religions in the United States, and one of the faster growing religions. The Prophet Muhammad lived from 570 to 632 of the Common Era. One interesting thing to point out is that many religions tell time differently, using different calendars, not only for holidays, but even for determining what year it is in their calendar. AD, Annus Domini, in the year of our Lord, reflects a Christian calendar. In any event, the Prophet Muhammad had grown up as an orphan, and you'll see that Islam often demonstrates a great deal of solidarity as well with those who are orphans and widows. Claims to have had a vision and he recited the words that he had been inspired by, which became the Quran. The Quran means recitation, and most devout Muslims around the world try to live by, study the Quran. In fact, if you are a Muslim and you can memorize the entire Quran, you have an honorific title added to your name. Many Muslims would say the Quran cannot be translated adequately out of Arabic, and unlike other sacred texts, it has not been changed over time. The term Islam, the term Muslim, and the term Salam are all related. They have the same root. And Islam is the religion. Muslim is one who submits to God, and Salam means peace. So the idea of Islam, Muslim, Salam being related to peace, wholeness, harmony is part of the very etymology of the words. A simplistic way of thinking about what are the main ideas in Islam is to begin with the 5 pillars. The first is the profession of faith. There's only one God, and Muhammad is his prophet. I want to point out that the word Allah is not unique to Islam. It is in fact Arabic. So if you are a Jew, a Christian, or a Muslim, you pray to Allah. If you were to translate Allah into another language, you could do so. Muhammad is not considered to be divine, and this is another important difference between Islam and Christianity. Muslims do not think that God has any partners. So even though Muslims recognize Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Job and Jesus as messengers of God, recognizes Muhammad as a messenger of God, it does not claim that he is divine, or certainly not the Son of God. The second pillar of Islam is prayer, 5 times daily facing Mecca. This prayer is one that I wish we could have gone to the mosque and seen the way it is performed. It is something that involves your whole body. It includes putting your head down below your heart, humbling yourself before God, recognizing your proper relationship with God. It involves different forms of prostration. It involves reciting passages from the Quran. Muslims are supposed to pray 5 times daily, if possible, and these are related to the sunrise and sunset and the midpoint between that, and then the 2 midpoints between that. Another one of the pillars of Islam is fasting during the month of Ramadan, and right now as we are speaking, it is the month of Ramadan, and so during the day from sunrise to sunset, Muslims will refrain from eating and drinking, and then as sunset approaches, they will again eat and drink. Fasting is common in many traditions. It is not as common in the United States as a form of sacrifice and trying to order what is important, and almsgiving to the poor. As we said before, one of the ideas behind Islam is that we are our brother's keeper, and we do have an obligation to the orphans, the widows, and the less fortunate. And the 5th pillar of Islam is the pilgrimage to Mecca that every devout Muslim is expected to make at least once in his or her life, if at all possible. We'll talk a little bit later about Malcolm X and his Hajj and how that transformed his understanding of Islam. So, for Islam, as you might say, similar to some other religions, peace is not simply nonviolence. Peace involves some sense of justice, some sense of mutuality. They are related. And just as we find there are justifications for violence and power in traditions like Christianity, we'll find similar theological, philosophical arguments for the proper use of power and the limits on the resort to violence. This little image, by the way, is from one of our visits to the mosque in St. Louis. Mesa is in the middle. She has spoken to roughly 1,000 Culver Stockton College students. We see that we had a special guest that day, a very well-renowned Muslim scholar. And I'm going to provide a very overly brief history of Islam. Notice that after Muhammad's death, we have the caliphate. Abu Bakr becomes the leader, and some of the traditions of Islam are beginning to be formalized under Uthman. Following Uthman, we see a conflict about who is the rightful heir, and this serves as the basis of the Sunni-Shiite split. 70 to 80% of Muslims in the world are Sunni, 10 to 15% are Shia. The classical era is sometimes described as the golden age of Islam. We see in this time period the growth, the expansion of Islam geographically, but also when we think of things like mathematics and science, we find that in many ways the Muslim world was more open-minded, more tolerant, more committed to science. And in fact, there's an interesting argument to be made that if Arabs had not preserved the writings of Aristotle, we might not have ever had the scientific revolution. Aristotle's ideas were shared not only by Muslim scholars, but they also, in Cordoba, Spain, had Maimonides, who is perhaps the most famous Jewish philosopher of all time, St. Thomas Aquinas, who's certainly one of the most famous Christian philosophers of all time, helped to rediscover Aristotle and create a more, you might say, scientific approach. We can look at different empires that have come and gone. The Turkish and Ottoman empires, certainly leading up to World War I, the Ottoman Empire was destroyed after that, and we see that that has had a profound impact on the way many Muslims have viewed history, often looking backwards to a golden age. And we talked about how some Christians have also, and Jews have also looked back to some golden age as opposed to looking forward. Islam around the world, notice depending on how the statistics are defined, but it's usually close to 1/5 of the world's population identified as Muslim. And we're going to point out, we'll talk a little bit more about how Muslims have been identified with terrorism in the United States because of the actions of a few. Notice Arabia is the cultural center of Islam, but there are many more Muslims living in Africa, for example. There are Muslims living throughout Southeast Asia. We see the concentration of Muslims in different places throughout the world. So in the United States, roughly half of all Muslims are immigrants or children of immigrants. Roughly a quarter are African American. And Islam is one of the fastest growing religions in America. I do want to make a note now about the Nation of Islam. Professor Farad in the 1920s claimed to have been to Arabia and discovered that the original religion of Black people was Islam. He claimed that through a process of technology, blonde-haired, blue-eyed devils had taken over the world, but that God would break into history, and um, that blacks would again be able to be empowered. He disappeared, and Elijah Muhammad became the next major leader of the Nation of Islam. And many people in the United States know of the Nation of Islam because of the teachings of Malcolm X. Malcolm X was never the leader, but he was the spokesperson for quite some time under Elijah Muhammad until he had a falling out with Elijah Muhammad. He ended up going to Mecca, and when he went to Mecca, he discovered that Muslims were of all races. Previous notions he had that Islam was the religion of black people and that Christianity was the religion of white people was somewhat exploded. And he ended up trying to embrace more traditional notions that we are all brothers and sisters created in the image of God. Unfortunately, he died shortly after. He was assassinated. His wife Betty would say he was assassinated by members of the Nation of Islam who did not like his new teachings. Most Muslims in the United States went the direction of Malcolm X after Mecca, becoming more interested in more Orthodox Islam, although there is still a branch that calls itself the Nation of Islam that is more interested in Black separatism. Why are there so many immigrants in the United States? Part of it has to do with the way our immigration system is set up. If there are people who are doctors and engineers who can help significantly with our economy, of course, we're happy to participate in any sort of brain drain that we can. Another reason is because of refugees, particularly if we start looking at how US foreign policy has sometimes pitted nations like Iran against Iraq or Saudi Arabia against Iran. As a result, oftentimes our allies have come as political refugees. And so this is another part of the reason that we have a large number of Muslims who have come to the United States in the last 50 years. Another reason that Islam is growing is that it tends to have higher birth rates than many other traditions. It also tends to have more traditional attitudes about women's roles in society, although within Islam that is hotly debated. I have talked to some Muslim women who have identified themselves as feminists, others who insist that to be a Muslim is to embrace more traditional views. This shouldn't be surprising to anyone who has studied the modernist fundamentalist debates in the United States or the culture wars thesis. Islam is also facing some of those same challenges. Because of the September 11th attacks, many people in the United States identify Islam and terrorism, and there were certain branches of Christianity that like to reinforce this theme. I was teaching a class at Culver Stockton College on that day, and I remember the lights went out. Some of you may not know that we actually had an electrical outage that day. We had a squirrel that apparently got into the transformer. For all we knew, we were part of some larger war. And I asked my students what was going on, and they said they attacked us. A couple of them said, they attacked us. I said, who? They said, the Muslims. I said, oh, how should we respond? They said, we should bomb them. I said, oh, so we should engage in genocide against 1/5 of the world's population because there are some Muslims who have attacked us. I said, well, no, that's not what I said. I don't think they understood how large Islam is, how many Muslims there are, how diverse it is. 19 al-Qaeda terrorists are the ones who hijacked 4 planes. There was greater support for that, but certainly most of the Muslims around the world are opposed to such type of activities. Shortly after the September 11th attacks, I was asked to participate in a month-long seminar in Los Angeles of Christian and Muslim scholars who met every day for a month to discuss the Bible and the Quran, to look at how these traditions can be used to justify violence and bigotry and hatred and injustice, but also how these traditions can promote peace and tolerance and understanding. Um, One of the leading scholars, Mustanzer Mir, was there. There were other Muslim scholars as well. Just as I mentioned earlier, there's a variety of perspectives. Most Christians are not pacifists. Most would support police and military and suggest violence is permissible under certain circumstances. And the same is true within Islam. The term jihad is a term that is important to Islam because it talks about struggle. There are two types, the greater jihad and the lesser jihad. The greater jihad is the internal struggle. The lesser jihad is the struggle with outsiders. So let's say that I have a problem with drug abuse and I decide I want to give up drugs. I am engaging in jihad when I decide I'm going to avoid temptation. So I'm going to prevent that. I'm going to struggle with myself. I'm going to try to do God's will, to submit to God's will, not to do things that are wrong. Asking Muslims to give up jihad would be like asking Christians to avoid giving up temptations. We need to understand the bigger concept. The secondary meaning of jihad is struggle with an external enemy. When you read the Quran, there are justifications for violence. For example, Surah 4, verse 74, let those fight in the way of God who sell the life of this world for the next. Whosoever fights in the way of God, be he slain or be he victorious, on him we will bestow a vast reward. Quran chapter 22, Surah 22, verses 39 through 40. This is another justification. However, notice it also provides limitations. And I also want to point out this claim, if God did not repel some people by others, cloisters and churches and synagogues and mosques in which God's name is much remembered would have been pulled down, and surely God will help him who helps him. Surely God is strong and mighty. Cloisters, that's where nuns and monks live. Churches, those are Christian places of worship. Synagogues, Jewish places of worship. I want to point out again that Islam identifies itself as part of the Abrahamic traditions and sees Christians and Jews as people of the book. They believe that God did reach out and that these communities were inspired in part by God, although according to the Quran, Jews and Christians deviated from God's path and God had to send another messenger. One interesting way of looking at this is that if some Christians said Old Covenant, New Covenant, Old Testament, New Testament, God rejected the Jewish people and became a Christian, you could say that there are some Muslims who have made a similar type of argument. Christians, because among other things, they worship Jesus instead of following his teachings, God rejected them and sent another messenger. There are a variety of perspectives within Islam about how tolerant Muslims can be towards non-Muslims. And it is, again, not unlike what we find within Christianity or Judaism. Again, there are limitations about justifications for violence. Be not aggressive. God loves not the aggressors. If they choose not to fight you, then you should not fight, even if they are not believers. There should be no hostility except against the oppressors. Notice there are passages in the Bible that have also been used to justify violence, and sometimes even what looks like ethnic cleansing. Chapter 4, verse 90 and verse 94, had God willed, he could have given them, your enemies, power over you, so assuredly he would have fought you. So if they hold aloof from you and wage not war against you and offer you peace, God allows you no way against them. And you who believe, when you fight in the way of God, discriminate. Don't say to someone who offers you peace, you aren't a believer. With God are abundant gains. Take care to discriminate. This is another distinction found in Christian just war theory, distinguishing between combatants and non-combatants, not simply dividing the world into Christian versus non-Christian or Muslim versus non-Muslim. Another passage that emphasizes continuity between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, chapter 2, verse 62, those who believe and those who are Jews and Christians and the Sabians, whoever believes in God and the last day and does good, they have their reward with the Lord, and there is no fear for them, nor shall they grieve. One of my favorite passages is Quran chapter 2, verse 256. There is no compulsion in religion. Let me ask you this. Do you believe that all Anks are buoy? And if you say, I don't even know what that means. What if I say the only way you can get an A in this class is if you believe all Anks are buoy? You can raise your hand, you can say you believe it, but if you don't understand it, you can't really believe something that you don't understand. You can say you believe it. That's part of the reason that many Muslims say you can't really force somebody to convert or to embrace a different religion, because then they're just pretending. They don't really believe what they're supposed to believe. At Culver Stockton College, there have been a number of events where we have gotten Jews and Christians and Muslims and others together, or to address challenges that might exist between different traditions. Some of these came about as a result of the 2001 9/11 terrorist attacks. Some of them came about because of events taking place in the world, like the Danish cartoon controversy. Some of you have participated in a CSC Leads on interfaith dialogue. You'll see several of us went to Egypt a few years back. And here is me sitting here in the tweed jacket. This was our tour guide down here. You also see that Dr. Elber Maui was here, and so was his wife. Dr. Elber Maui has done a great deal of work in this region, trying to educate people about Islam. His kids and my kids went to school together. I consider him to be an important interfaith leader in our area. So there's a lot we could talk about Islam in the United States, and I think I do want to go back for a minute. So people in the United States are influenced by the different rituals. Many are familiar with the prayer. Many are familiar with the buildings. Many are familiar with the practice of fasting during the month of Ramadan. Many recognize that the calendar for Islam is going to influence many events in public schools. My senior year in college, one of the top runners in the United States was Muslim, and because of the way Ramadan, the end of Ramadan appeared, he ended up not running in the national meet. These are things that if you are a school teacher, for example, you might want to think about how religion impacts different people's lives. Many people in the United States are familiar with Islam because of famous Muslims, whether it's someone, Cat Stevens is a famous musician, some of you may be familiar with, a little older. There was Malcolm X, there's Muhammad Ali, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. These were originally members of the Nation of Islam, many becoming later Orthodox Muslims. So there have been a lot of influence of Islam in the United States. The next tradition we're going to look at is Hinduism. And Hinduism is a term that we use to describe people, the traditions native to India for the past 3,500 years. Now, people in that region would not have called themselves Hindu 3,000 years ago or even 500 years ago. It's a relatively recent term used by Europeans to describe the people of the Indus Valley region. Hinduism is different than most world religions. Most world religions, we can identify the founder. It was Abraham or Muhammad or Jesus or Siddhartha Gautama, Confucius. Hinduism begins from many different centers. Perhaps it was many different tribal religions that all came together and recognized that the images they used to describe God were not necessarily, even if they were different, that didn't mean that they were incomplete, contradictory. Within Hinduism, there is a synthesis of traditions and a recognition that my own understanding is limited and partial, so there are many paths to the truth. There are several sacred texts, the oldest being the Vedas. The Vedas describe different rituals, for example, famous rituals associated with fire, the sacrifices made to the gods. The Upanishads began as an interpretation of the Vedas and themselves became a sacred text. Laws of Manu describe the ethics and social rules for society. The epic poems, the Mahabharata and Ramayana, provide not only a source for a great deal of popular culture and entertainment, but they also have different riddles for how you can understand the nature of reality and how we ought to live our lives. One small part of the Mahabharata is the Bhagavad Gita, in which it is believed that Lord Krishna reveals divine teachings. Krishna, who is the warrior hero in Indian history, was originally a pacifist, and he was persuaded by his chariot driver to actually engage in this cosmic battle, you would say. We have here the three probably most powerful gods in Indian understanding. We have, let's see, Shiva, we have Krishna in the middle, and we have Brahman. By the way, Ganesha is, according to tradition, the author of the Mahabharata, the scribe, I should say, who wrote down the story. He is the god of writers, the god of thieves. According to tradition, he was born fully grown, and his father was Shiva, the destroyer. His father came home and said, "Who are you?" Ganesha said, "I don't know. Who are you?" Shiva, the Lord of all the worlds, was angry and said, "This is my house. I don't know who you are." And he ends up cutting off his son's head, throws it off beyond the Himalayas, and Parvati comes in and says, "What have you done to our son?" Shiva, the Lord of all the worlds, recognizes he has made a mistake. His arrogance has once again brought him down low. So he finds the head of an elephant, which is the first head he can find, and he restores Ganesha to life. Ganesha, for his part, did not recognize his father because he thought if he's the Lord of all the worlds, if he's the destroyer, he should look powerful, but he looked like a rag picker. He looked like a peasant. Anyway, the Mahabharata suggests that if you can read such stories and understand the underlying moral, the underlying principle, you can begin to break the chains of karma, which is going to lead us to the next ideas. Some of the key concepts. The first is karma. Many of you are familiar with this. Some you might have heard it expressed as what goes around comes around. Within Hinduism is the idea that we have been born or can be born many times. Life is a potentially endless cycle of birth and death and rebirth. Within Hinduism, though, this is not necessarily a good thing. The goal is moksha, liberation from the prison of samsara. Karma is the stain or the chain that binds us to this world. So by eliminating karma, we are able to break this chain of birth and death and rebirth and attain our sense of oneness with ultimate reality. I'm going to skip the forecast for a moment and point out the four different paths to the attainment of moksha. They're the ritualistic tradition, which emphasizes, as they do in the Vedas, that sacrifice breaks the chains of samsara. The yogic traditions, which suggest that we should withdraw from the world of action and desire. The bhakti or devotional love tradition says that a love of a god like Krishna can help to break the chains of samsara. And finally, the philosophical traditions that emphasize the oneness of all things. Um, I want to point out, if you ask several Hindus how many gods there are in Hinduism, some will say, well, there are hundreds, and I can name them for you. Others will say there's only one God, Brahman, and all other gods are, in some sense, a manifestation of this one God. And finally, you'll have some Hindus who will say there are no gods. The philosophical branches will say that God is simply a concept to help us understand the harmony and interconnectedness of all things. This notion of Maya, that the world is illusion, or Atman, that we're all a part of this universal self, the substance of Brahman. Within traditional Hinduism, as described in the laws of Manu, there are four castes: the priestly caste, the warrior caste, the merchant caste, and the worker class. Notice that reformers like Gandhi sought to challenge the caste system and argue, why can't we believe in justice from one lifetime to the next and try to promote a sense of justice in this lifetime? So the modern nation of India does not acknowledge caste, although many people are familiar with which caste they would have belonged to. Hinduism in America has had a profound impact. Notions like karma, meditation, yoga, other practices are well known in American culture. One of the most influential Muslim Hindus of the 20th century is Mahatma Gandhi. And Gandhi's nonviolent revolution against the British to bring about Indian independence was very inspirational. Some would say that Gandhi may have been the single most influential figure of the 20th century. His nonviolent revolutions reverberated on every continent in different movements, and it actually impacted almost every other religion. One example I would like to point out is that Martin Luther King Jr. actually met with Gandhi. He had been inspired by Howard Thurman. Howard Thurman had been in India, had heard about Gandhi. He once asked Gandhi, why can't I get people to convert to Christianity? And Gandhi said the greatest threat to the credibility of Christianity in India is not Hinduism, it is not Islam, it is not atheism. The greatest threat to the credibility of Christianity is Christians. The greatest threat to the credibility of Islam is Muslims, and the greatest threat to the credibility of Buddhists is Buddhists. Greatest threat to the credibility of Hindus is Hinduism. Kind of mess that up, but hopefully you get the point I'm making. King famously said that Jesus provided the motivation and Gandhi provided the method for his philosophy of nonviolent resistance. This notion of ahisma, of nonviolence, that comes out of Jainism and some varieties of Hinduism has been very influential. It has inspired certain forms of vegetarian and veganism in the United States, a sense of interconnectedness, a sense of tolerance that has influenced people not only who are Hindu, but even people who are not Hindu are familiar with some of these concepts. The next religion we're going to talk about is Buddhism. Siddhartha Gautama lived in India. He lived from 563 to 483 before the Common Era. So he grew up in an area that was Hindu. And according to tradition, he was trying all of the different paths. His parents had been warned he would either become a great religious leader or a great political leader, so they did what every intelligent parent would do. They kept him away from religion, and they wanted him to be a great, powerful political ruler, a king. One day, he left the palace and he saw some suffering, he saw death, and he says that he spent the rest of his life trying to find a solution to suffering and death. He tried the ascetic practices of the Hindu yogis, and he didn't find them satisfactory. So One day, while meditating under a Bodhi tree, he came to the realization. The realization was the harmony, the interconnectedness, the oneness of all things. And you see some parallels here between Buddhism and the philosophical traditions of Hinduism. So the Four Noble Truths are perhaps the best way to think about the ideas of Buddhism. The first is the nature of life. And life is full of suffering and sorrow, joys, emptiness, and permanence. Um, the goal is to recognize this nature. Notice that's not unlike what we find in Hinduism, the idea that in some sense life is hard and the goal is to escape from this suffering. But what is the origin of dukkha? This is where we see a more significant break between Buddhism and Hinduism. According to Siddhartha Gautama, the origin of this suffering is desire, thirst. I want. It is only when we eliminate the want that we can destroy the illusion of self and realize the oneness of all things. Now that's going to sound very strange probably to many Americans who grow up in a very, it's all about me, egocentric world. But according to the Buddha, those who understand the nature of reality live in harmony. The idea that I think I can benefit myself by harming you, Siddhartha Gautama would say, is an unenlightened view. The third noble truth is enlightenment, nirvana, satori, a recognition, not simply an intellectual understanding, but a feeling of this oneness, losing one's sense of self. And finally, the Eightfold Path is the fourth noble truth. The Buddha spent the last decades of his life talking about what is right understanding, right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. So Buddhism is most commonly associated, it's spread along the Silk Trail. Buddhism ends up being kind of swallowed up within India. Siddhartha Gautama is considered another incarnation of Vishnu, but Buddhism becomes a separate religion in China, in Japan, Tibet, Mongolia. I do want to make a point about the distinction between Theravada and Mahayana Buddhism. Theravada is the older tradition, and it's more likely to emphasize withdrawing from this world, maintaining a sense of purity so that we're not attracted to wealth and power and pleasure. Whereas the Mahayana Buddhism draws upon the Sunya, void doctrine, to insist that life on the mountaintop and the monastery is just as empty as life in the middle of the city. So maybe if I want to overcome the illusion of self, maybe I shouldn't be seeking my own enlightenment. Maybe I should be serving others. Maybe a soup kitchen would be better than living in a monastery. Notice the Bodhisattva is someone who is destined to become a Buddha, someone who's destined to attain enlightenment, but is more interested in relieving the suffering of others than of attaining one's own enlightenment. Well, there are numerous branches of Buddhism, particularly out of the Mahayana traditions, that are going to flow, many of them related to different national ethnic groups. The Pure Land sect often thinks of nirvana as a paradise, which might sound a little bit like the Christian, Jewish, Muslim notions of heaven. The intuitive sects, Chan and Zen, talk about the importance of having one's own religious enlightenment, a flash of insight, modeled on the Buddha's own experience. If one can experience enlightenment for oneself and realize the sense of oneness, that's how one understands what is real and true. The rationalist sect, in some ways, sounds more like what you might find in some Protestant traditions that emphasize reading the sacred text, studying the traditions. It's a more rational approach and focuses on discovering the truth revealed in the history and traditions and scriptures of Buddhism. Nichiren Buddhism particularly Soka Gakkai, is going to become very widespread in the United States, and Tibetan Buddhism. We'll talk a little bit about uh, the leader of the Tibetan Buddhist movement, the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama is actually here, showed with the famous actor Richard Gere. I was fortunate enough to meet the Dalai Lama in Indianapolis when I was teaching there. And he has won the Nobel Peace Prize for some of his work in engaged Buddhism. So, Buddhism in America, roughly 1.2 million Buddhists live in the United States. 1/3 of the Buddhists in the United States are Asian, and roughly half are white. 40% of Buddhists in the United States live in Southern California, but Hawaii has the highest percentage of Buddhists. 8% of the people in Hawaii are Buddhist. The first major wave of immigrants to the United States from China came with the gold rush in California in the 1830s, 40s. Influential Buddhists, some of these are people whose works I have shared with my students over time. In fact, I've shared all of those. There are many Buddhists who have helped to inspire others. So even though there are only 1.2 million Buddhists in the United States, Buddhism has influenced American culture well beyond those numbers. I've pointed out, for example, the peace movement of the 1970s was very much inspired by the work of some Buddhists to promote nonviolent responses. We see Yoda articulating a philosophy that is part Buddhist, part Taoist, the Karate Kid. We see in American popular culture different ways that Buddhism is like represented, sometimes merely as caricatures, but this is going to influence our society as well. And there are more religions, Native American, indigenous African traditions, Baha'i, Sikh, Taoist, Confucian, Jain, Shinto. We could go on. We could spend hours looking at the influence of each of these religions in America, pointing out famous philosophers, historians, lawyers, politicians, actors, pointing out their influence in different ways. But hopefully this will give you a little bit further insight into other religions in America. Thank you very much.